Joining us now from Nairobi, Aly-Khan Satchu is an economist and CEO of the East African financial company Rich Management. From Beijing, Chen Chenchen is the Deputy Director for the Department of Macroeconomics at Renmin University of China. From Johannesburg, Adetunji Omotola is an analyst in Pan-African affairs focusing on business development. And with us here in the studio, Yun Sun is a Senior Associate in the East Asia program at the Stimson Center. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Ali, let me start with you in Nairobi. So this Mombasa railway is now fully operational. What kind of impact is this rail link going to have on Kenya?
I think it's going to have a dramatic and catalytic impact on the economy. This is Kenya's biggest post-independence investment in more than 50 years. And I think we're going to see substantial economic spillover effects now that it's in play. You know, there's been a lot of talk and chatter about how low-cost manufacturing has become too expensive in China, and how a lot of these jobs had to transfer to parts of Africa. And I think this gives Kenya a real shot at grabbing some of those jobs that are going to come this way. And one further point to consider is that Kenya is a transit state. It's a linchpin state. And we really have to have 21st century infrastructure in place if we want to leverage that position with all these adjacent countries. So yes, big win, big game changer. The proof will be in the eating. The eating's about to begin.
Chen Chen, this is a major investment for China. This project costs something like $3.8 billion, and it's expected to add 1.5% to Kenya's GDP. But what does it do for the overall trade relationship between Kenya and China?
Well, I think Kenya is quite an ideal partner for China to work with. If you look at the dynamics, Kenya is China's largest trading partner in the East African region, and Kenya itself is a leading country in EAC, in East African community. Also politically and geographically, Kenya is also China's ideal trading partner. If you look at the specific railway project linking Nairobi to Mombasa, you can see that geographically, in the future, this railway project will become the core of the whole regional traffic network. And politically, the two countries share the consensus that the infrastructure development should be expanded, and this will be a foundation for the regional economic integration.
So, of course, this project is part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, a very ambitious project undertaken by the Chinese. How important is this railway link going to be towards the creation of what China wants, a more interconnected Africa?
Well, for China's Belt and Road Initiative endeavors in Africa, railway project like this one is, of course, a signature project as we see the progress of the Chinese investment in infrastructure development in Africa. China has paid a lot of attention and emphasis on the transportation network to be developed in the African continent, and it has a very sound logic to it, using the Chinese experience to stimulate trade and to stimulate local economic growth. Better transportation network is absolutely necessary. It's indispensable for the future growth of Africa. And in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, China's plan is also to promote the cooperation in the industrial capacity between China and Africa. Like one of the guests had already mentioned, that China faces a problem of its own labor-intensive industries need to be transferred to other areas and to other countries. And Africa has been identified as an optimum destination for such investment. So for China to eventually move some of its more labor-intensive industries to Africa, this type of infrastructure is a foundation for that.
All right, let's bring in Adetunji from Johannesburg. Adetunji, this is Kenya's first big railway project in almost 1 century. How much of a game changer will it be, not just for Kenya, but for East Africa as a whole?
Well, I think that this is very commendable news in terms of infrastructure, first for Kenya, but more so for the region, because we know that East Africa is one of the most connected regions in the whole of Africa. So that strengthens that logic. But also, if you look to the east of Kenya, in the same region, you've had Ethiopia and Djibouti. There's another railway there for about 750 kilometers, which is about $4 billion, also a Chinese project. So this is definitely going to boost trade in that part of the world, because you've got about almost 300 million people in East Africa. But what is also important is that the China-Africa Forum, which is focused on improving the infrastructure deficit in the continent, it has been given a boost by this railway. If you recall, there's also a railway that has been put in place from Kaduna, from Abuja to Kaduna, which costs about almost $1 billion. And also in every other part of Africa, China is very involved in expanding the infrastructure, be it gas pipelines, deep sea ports, or rail, or even airports. So this is a good boost for Africa's infrastructure deficit program and a good boost for regional integration.
Aly-Khan Satchu, when we look at what this project will do for Kenya, there is that projection of an increase of 1.5% for Kenya's GDP. Do you think a railway project, this kind of corridor between two major cities, will generate that kind of growth for Kenya?
Yes, I do. And I think, if you look at Kenya on a map, the main economic activity is along this economic corridor. Of course, we want to see the railway extended to Kisumu, which is the lakeside city, and then hopefully into Uganda and even as far as the DR Congo. With respect to how the economy is going to behave, I think, we're now going to see the real effect. We're going to see people creating businesses, small manufacturing hubs along the corridor, tapping in to the geothermal energy which we have in abundance. And really, the magic ingredients of industrialization is cheap power, cheap transport to a global market of nearly 3 billion people on the wider Indian Ocean rim, and essentially good human capital. And I think Kenya's got all three, and that really distinguishes it from other African countries. And then also, you've got to cement that regional situation, the fact that we are the distribution route, this corridor is the route inland for all the imports, and also out for all these other countries. So I think 1.5 might be an underestimate if things play out well.
Chen Chenchen, this project has not been without criticism. There is a Kenyan newspaper, The Standard, which accused China of using the project to, quote, tighten China's grip on the Kenyan economy. What do you make of that?
I think the word either control or grip is quite a colonial concept. Actually, Kenya has been independent for so many years, and specifically on this project, actually, the Kenyan government has had comprehensive and several rounds of consideration and assessment before it made up the decision to cooperate with China on this project. And for China, of course, it wants to look at clearly whether the project would be profitable in the long run, and whether in the long term, both sides could maximum the benefits from it. Actually, the infrastructure, this railway project is just a start. The two countries or the two sides actually are expecting more accompanying effect in the future. For example, after the railway project becomes operational, of course, we are expecting industrial parks. We are expecting facilitated investment and trade. So in the long run, there will be more benefit for both sides.
Yun-Sun, there are some African countries which have criticized China's involvement as what they call cement and concrete diplomacy. But that notwithstanding, as African nations look for new and innovative ways to boost their economies, their development, how important is a partner like China?
China, as an external financier to Africa infrastructure development, has been not only important, but also indispensable for the process. Because if you look at a project like this Mombasa-Nairobi railway, it's not that the Kenyan government has not made the effort to find other financing for a project like this. But it turned out that China is the only one who is not only able but also willing to fund a project, but also provide all sorts of technical assistance and contract service related to it. So I think the real question for African countries and African governments is no deal is free, and it all depends on negotiation. It also depends on your bargaining power, that how many viable options and alternatives you do have when you seek a project like this. And in many cases, China does indeed provide the best deal on the table. And I would not blame the African governments for taking them. Then, of course, the next question is, after those projects are completed, how to manage the projects, how to maximize the African benefits from the Chinese investment. That's a question, a difficult one, for African governments to answer. But also, honestly, if anything goes wrong, I think China will get blamed for it.
Adetunji, you talked a moment ago about some of the other projects that China is involved in Africa. How big is Chinese involvement in infrastructure development across the continent?
Well, I think over the last decade, I mean, there was the biggest one, I think, of Nigeria, the Lagos to Calabar, which was meant to be about $12 billion, but that has been scaled down significantly. And even the one that was meant to go from Kano, I believe from Abuja to Kano, has been scaled down significantly. And there's the $7 billion project in South Africa in a place called Modderfontein, which will bring about 100,000 residents into what they call the New York of Africa. So in totality, you're looking at over $100 billion in the last decade. But the challenge, though, is that most of the projects are not always investments. Some of them are loans, and some of them are barter, like what you have in the DRC with copper and cobalt, and also some of them are export credits. But I think what is significant is that the Chinese are coming into Africa. They're supporting every aspect from dams, hydroelectric dams, to in terms of energy, in terms of deep sea ports, in terms of railways, in terms of airports. And they're really doing more than what the West is doing at the moment. But what the challenge is for African leaders or countries is they must negotiate that the quality of the projects and the finish is as good as the contracts that they've signed. Because if the contracts, for example, I spoke to somebody earlier, and they said some of the trains in between Abuja and Kaduna, some of the bits have fallen off. So I think the African governments need to negotiate harder and ensure that the quality meets the excitement. Because if there's no quality, then there isn't any gain in the end.
Okay, we need to take a break right now. Coming up, China has committed more than $60 billion to investment in Africa. Our panel weighs in on the mutual benefits and addresses the criticisms. Next, stay with us, you're watching The Heat.